The waiter looked at me suspiciously. Perhaps it was because of the unusual request, or perhaps because the silence was filled with something he couldn't describe. I simply handed over the small, shiny ring, holding it between my fingers like someone holding the weight of a lifetime. It was my marriage, my story, all condensed into that cold, metallic ring. Delivered to the table in the corner. The woman in the blue dress. You can say her husband sent it. The waiter hesitated, but did as I asked. My eyes never stopped following his footsteps. He walked between the elegant tables of that crowded restaurant, dodging chairs, conversations, lives that went about their routines unaware of the hurricane inside me. And then he stopped. There she was. My wife. Laughing. Her laugh was the same one I knew so well, that soft sound that had once made me fall in love. The man sitting opposite her was leaning over the table, smiling as if he were delighted. And perhaps he was. Because that woman, my wife, had the gift of capturing eyes and holding hearts. Even mine. Until she decided to destroy it. I wanted to get out of there. The urge to turn away and forget the scene was almost irresistible. But at the same time, something was holding me back. I needed to see. I needed to witness the moment when she would realize. The waiter put the ring on the table, along with the note I had written a few words before, with a calmness I didn't know myself. This ring no longer belongs to you. Neither do I. Forget me forever. She looked at the ring as if it were a bomb about to explode. The laughter died down. The man in front of her frowned, confused, and muttered something I couldn't hear. But I didn't need to hear anything. I could see the panic in her eyes, the desperation in the way her hands shook as she touched the small ring. I saw when she stood up abruptly, knocking over the glass of wine on the white tablecloth, dyeing it red. The people around her began to murmur, their heads turned, curious. She began to cry. Real tears or not, it didn't matter. The phone started ringing almost immediately. It was her. I saw her name glow on the screen of my cell phone like a ghost. I let it ring. 1 ring. 2. 3. The same insistence that once convinced me to get married. That made me promise an eternity by her side. Finally, I picked up. The sound of her voice came in sobs, a mixture of regret and despair. Please let me explain. You don't understand. I kept silent, letting her hear the echo of her own words. And then I replied with the calm of a man who has crossed the point of no return, forget I exist. Forever. I hung up the phone. But at that moment, standing in front of the restaurant, feeling the cold night wind hit my face, I realized that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The beginning of a downfall, hers and his. The man who destroyed my marriage. The lover who, by pure whim or fate, came into my life uninvited and turned it into shards. You might think it was easy for me. That I walked out of there free, like someone lifting a weight off their back. But the emptiness that consumed me was greater than any relief. It was the absence of a lifetime. It was the weight of knowing that the love we had built, or that I thought we had built, was nothing more than a house of cards. And now, all the cards were on the ground. As I drove home that night, the images wouldn't leave my mind. Her smile, so intimate, directed at another man. Her touch on his hand. The way she cried when she realized the game was over. I knew it wouldn't end there. She would try to explain. She would try to come back. But what about him? He would continue with the same arrogance of someone who thinks he can steal someone's happiness without paying a price for it. But fate has a strange way of settling the score. At the time, I still didn't know what was to come. I didn't know that, before long, they themselves would fall into a trap that the world itself had prepared. I didn't know that, as much as the pain of betrayal burned me like fire, it would be the same betrayal that would turn their lives upside down. I didn't need to take revenge. The universe would do that for me. And as the night wore on, with her calling once, twice, 10 times without an answer, I realized that this was the most decisive moment of my life. Because, in that instant, I stopped being the man who accepted excuses. I stopped being the man who turned a blind eye to little lies. And I began to be the man who rebuilt his own story with his own hands. "Why are you doing this to me?" she shouted in the last voice message, her voice embittered, almost unrecognizable. I deleted the message. I didn't need to hear that. Because deep down, she knew exactly why. She knew what she had done. Betrayal isn't just an act. It's an avalanche. And at that moment, the avalanche was only just starting down the mountain. She still didn't know what was coming. She didn't know that the man sitting in front of her, her lover, was also hiding secrets. That the world she had chosen to build, outside of our marriage, was about to collapse on her. And as I drove into an unknown future, a single question haunted me: how far can a wounded heart go to find peace? This is the story of a love that was broken. A betrayal that destroyed more than just a marriage. A series of secrets and twists and turns that none of us could have predicted. But I promise you one thing, the story is far from over. And in the end, the price she and her lover will pay will be higher than any of us could have imagined. Because, at the end of the day, no one comes out unscathed when they play with the heart of someone who didn't deserve to be betrayed. Welcome to the channel, where we don't support betrayal and never romanticize it. Here, you'll find fictional stories, but with a clear purpose, to show how betrayal can destroy lives, families and dreams. These are tales that explore the real consequences of wrong choices, leaving a powerful message about love, loyalty and respect. Get ready now for a shocking story full of intense emotions, surprising twists and an ending you'll never forget. Fasten your seatbelts, the story is about to begin. Have a good listen. The clock struck 7 in the morning when the first rays of sunlight broke through the bedroom shutters. The light spread slowly around the room, illuminating the neutral-toned walls and the crystal chandelier that hung from the center of the ceiling. The silence in the house was interrupted only by the muffled sound of the shower, where André was finishing his morning bath. He was a methodical man, with firm and precise habits. At 38, his life was marked by impeccable routine. Every morning, André woke up early, went for a light jog around the neighborhood, prepared breakfast and headed to the office where he worked as an administrative manager for a large company. That day, while drying his face with a fluffy white towel, he looked in the mirror and noticed small frown lines around his eyes. André was not a vain man, but he valued the image he conveyed. His serious and reliable countenance was the result of years of dedication to his work and family. He dressed quickly, dark dress pants, a well-worn light blue shirt and a wristwatch given to him by his wife Clara on their 5th wedding anniversary. Clara was André's opposite in many ways. While he was methodical and not very impulsive, she was creative, spontaneous and emotional. At 35, she worked as an interior designer, a profession that perfectly matched her sensitive eye for colors, shapes and textures. Since she had started working for herself, her mornings had become more relaxed. Unlike André, Clara liked to wake up later, when the sun was high and the smell of coffee, prepared by him, invaded the room. Their relationship, in everyone's eyes, was solid. A successful, beautiful and harmonious couple. They had an elegant house, bought with effort and divided between their two very different styles, André's methodical minimalism and Clara's warm, sophisticated touch. It was the home where they celebrated their greatest victories, their wedding, their travels, their first anniversary in Italy, and also where they learned to overcome the small challenges of everyday life. That morning, André came downstairs while Clara was still lounging in bed. The kitchen was silent, only the sound of the coffee machine being turned on filled the space. André opened the newspaper, as he did every morning, and flipped through the pages without paying much attention. His gaze was fixed on any one point, as if his mind was wandering between random thoughts. In truth, he didn't usually verbalize his emotions easily, but inside he felt that there had been something different recently. Something he couldn't name. Perhaps it was just the weight of his self-imposed responsibilities. Clara came down about an hour later, wearing a white silk robe. Her hair was loose and tousled, giving her a carefree, natural look. She smiled when she saw André still at the table, drinking coffee and reading the news. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Yes. And you?" "Fine, but I woke up with an idea for that project at the Martins' house. I think I've finally found the perfect combination for the living room." André nodded, smiling sideways. He loved listening to Clara talk about her work, even if he didn't understand half the words she used to describe styles and trends. For him, Clara was a universe apart, full of life, energy and dreams. He knew that she brightened up any place she went, and for this reason, she never lacked for expressions of admiration and respect. Breakfast passed in comfortable silence, like so many other times. André looked at Clara as she leafed through a magazine, and for a moment he felt a slight twinge in his chest. It wasn't pain. It was a strange mixture of longing and fear. He quickly pushed the thought away, taking the last sip of coffee. "I'm leaving early today. We have an important meeting and I want to go over the numbers first," he warned, getting up from the table. Clara smiled. "All right. Have a good meeting, love." André walked past her and left a quick kiss on her forehead. He walked out of the door and to his car, where the silence of the enclosed space gave him time to think. The streets were busy, cars honking, children crossing with backpacks bigger than themselves. André took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had accompanied him lately. Meanwhile, Clara was getting ready for the day. She spent the rest of the morning working on the Martins project, distributing fabrics and testing color combinations in the large office she had set up in the house. Her mind was focused on the details, but every now and then she found herself staring at the window, lost in thought. Clara also felt that something was different. Not in the house, not at work, but inside her. A silent restlessness, as if something was out of place, but impossible to identify. The day followed its usual rhythm. André was immersed in meetings, spreadsheets and calls, while Clara visited suppliers and had lunch with a close friend. In the late afternoon, André returned home earlier than expected. He found Clara sitting on the sofa in the living room, with a notebook on her lap and a pencil clutched between her fingers. She looked at him with mild surprise. "You're early today. Was the meeting good?" "Yes, it was productive. I decided to move a few things around the house." André sat down next to her, loosening his tie. He looked around the room, noticing the small adjustments Clara had made recently. She was always changing something, a new cushion here, a different picture there. He admired her ability to transform any space into a living, pulsating place. It was a talent he would never have. The two of them chatted about trivialities over dinner. Clara told him about the fabrics she had chosen. André commented on a change of leadership in the company. It was a simple routine, but one that had been enough for both of them for years. After dinner, André went upstairs to his office, while Clara stayed in the living room, immersed in a book she had started weeks before. When he returned, he found her asleep on the sofa, the book open on her chest. He approached her carefully, picked up the book and put it on the table. He stayed there for a moment, watching her sleep. Clara seemed so serene, so far from any worry he could imagine. But André knew deep down that appearances could be deceiving. That even the most solid of castles could hide invisible cracks. The clock struck almost midnight when he finally went up to his room. He lay down next to Clara, who mumbled something in her sleep and turned the other way. André stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft sound of her breathing. And for the first time in a long time, he felt afraid. Afraid that this peace was just an illusion. Afraid that, without realizing it, he might be letting something slip through his fingers. Meanwhile, Clara continued to sleep, oblivious to his worries. She was dreaming, lost in a world where problems didn't exist, where shadows didn't lurk in the deepest corners of the soul. At that moment, the house was silent, enveloped in a fragile calm. But soon, that calm would be shattered. And neither Clara nor André knew that their lives were about to change forever. André felt the weight of the days piling up on his shoulders. Work had been demanding more of him, and the figures, even when positive, couldn't dispel that nagging feeling that something was slipping through the invisible cracks in his life. The house continued at the same quiet pace, the mornings filled with the smell of fresh coffee and his hurried footsteps. Clara, on the other hand, seemed distant. It wasn't something he could define with words. Perhaps it was the long silences between one conversation and another, or the way her gaze wandered over nothing, as if she were somewhere else. He tried to ignore it, believing that any disconnection between the two of them was just the result of tiredness and worn-out routines. "You've been so quiet, André. Is everything all right?" she asked one evening, as he fiddled with his plate of food almost without touching it. He looked up and smiled weakly. "Of course. Just tired. Nothing much." The answer seemed satisfactory to Clara, who just nodded and looked away. André watched her in silence. She looked beautiful, as always. Her loose hair falling over her shoulders, her slender fingers playing with the rim of her wine glass. Why did he feel like he didn't know her anymore? Part of him just wanted to grab her by the shoulders and ask her what was going on, but that wasn't his place. André was not a man for confrontation. The weeks went by, and the distance between them grew almost imperceptibly, like a crack at the base of a wall which, at first, is just a thin line, but which, over time, threatens to bring down the whole structure. Clara continued with her visits to clients, her meetings in charming cafes and the hours spent in the office putting together projects. Everything seemed normal, but André began to notice small details. Her cell phone, which used to be left lying around the house, was now always in her pocket or turned face down. Messages, once received without concern, were now answered with a restrained smile, a quick gesture and some kind of excuse. Work. A client is driving me crazy with all the changes. He believed it. Or wanted to. André was not the kind of man to doubt, to create ghosts where there are none. Clara was his wife, the woman with whom he had shared years of trust and love. But that knot in his chest could no longer be ignored. One afternoon, André left work early. His head was pounding with the need to get away from spreadsheets and meetings. Instead of driving straight home, he decided to stop at a nearby cafe. The idea was simple: grab a cappuccino, sit down for a few minutes and clear his head. The place was busy, the sound of conversations mixing with the noise of the coffee machine. It was then that he saw her. Clara was sitting at a table near the window. She was laughing. It was that light laugh, the same laugh that had once made him fall madly in love. But the smile wasn't for him. Sitting opposite her was an unknown man, elegant, with a neatly trimmed beard and a confident look. Their posture was too close, too intimate to be just work or friendship. Her hands rested on the table, close to his, and, in a moment that André would never forget, the man gently touched her fingers, as if the gesture were natural, ordinary. André froze. The sight hit him like a punch in the stomach, leaving him breathless. He didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to jump in, shout, demand an explanation, but his feet wouldn't move. He remained still, watching the scene like an invisible spectator of his own life. Clara was still laughing, her eyes sparkling in a way he hadn't seen for a long time. She seemed happy. But it wasn't with him. The coffee went cold in his hands and André left the place unnoticed. He drove aimlessly, his mind spinning between disconnected images. Every detail of that encounter replayed in his head like an uninterrupted movie: the hands, the touch, the laughter. How had he not noticed before? How could he have been so blind? When he got home, the usual silence seemed heavier. Clara wasn't back yet. André sat in the armchair in the living room, staring at the emptiness. The clock on the wall ticked away the hours, each second echoing in his head. He tried to find an excuse, a plausible explanation for what he had seen. Maybe it was a client, maybe it was just friendship. But the image of the touch, that soft, intimate touch, wouldn't leave him alone. When Clara walked through the door a few hours later, she looked carefree, almost radiant. "Are you early today?" she asked, dropping her bag on the sofa. André looked at her, studying every detail of her face. Was there something different about her expression? Any guilt? Any signs? "I had a headache. I decided to come early." Clara just nodded, walking over to him to leave a quick kiss on his forehead. The smell of her perfume, which he loved so much, now seemed cloying. André closed his eyes for a moment, trying to contain the wave of anger and sadness that washed over him. Over the next few days, he watched Clara with different eyes. Every time she left, every message on her cell phone, every distant smile seemed like another piece of the puzzle he didn't want to put together. Until, finally, he made the decision to confirm his suspicions. The following Friday, André told her he had to go away on business. It was a lie, but he needed to find out the truth. That evening, he stood in his car, a few blocks from home, watching the lights on in the living room. The clock ticked slowly, and then he saw her leave. Clara looked beautiful, wearing a blue dress that he recognized as one of his favorites. She got into her car and drove towards the city center. André followed her, his heart pounding, his hands sweaty on the steering wheel. He felt like a detective in a cheap movie, but the truth was that he needed the certainty he feared so much. When Clara pulled up in front of an upscale restaurant, André parked across the street. He saw her get out of the car and be greeted by the same man he had seen in the cafe. They hugged. Not a friendly hug, but something longer, more intimate. André stood there, watching the scene with burning eyes. He didn't need any more proof. The betrayal was there, exposed in front of him. A part of him wanted to go into the restaurant and confront them, but another part, the quieter, more rational part, said that this moment was hers. That Clara was far, far away from him, that any attempt to bring her back would be in vain. He returned home that night a defeated man. The world around him seemed to be falling apart, but the worst was yet to come. Because, deep down, André knew that this was only the beginning. There was something more, something he didn't know yet, but which was waiting to be revealed. The truth was there, like a lurking shadow, ready to transform their lives into something unrecognizable. Clara arrived home late, but didn't find André waiting. He was already in bed, or at least pretended to be. She quietly entered the room, removed her shoes and lay down next to him, as if nothing had happened. André kept his eyes closed, his chest tight, and silently promised himself that the story wouldn't end like this. The pieces were moving. And what came after that night would change everything. André woke up early that morning. The sky outside had a grayish hue, as if the day itself anticipated the storm that was about to descend upon them. He got up in silence, without looking to the side where Clara was still sleeping soundly, her face serene in the midst of the chaos he knew was about to explode. His every movement, every step on the wooden floor of the bedroom seemed to echo louder than usual, as if the whole house realized the gravity of what was about to happen. In the makeshift office next to the bedroom, André stood still for a moment, looking at the documents on the table, the phone next to him. His heart was pounding harder. He had discovered something that had completely consumed him over the last few days, something that made Clara's betrayal an even deeper wound. Not only had she betrayed him. She was by that man's side for a reason he could never have imagined. It all started with a call André had received from the bank 3 days earlier. A suspicious movement in their joint account. André, as meticulous as ever, never let money disappear without explanation. On that call, he was informed of a large withdrawal and a transfer made by Clara to an unknown account. This made him suspect that there was something much bigger behind the betrayal. Clara didn't seem like the kind of person who would touch his finances for no reason. Doubt ate away at his every thought. So Andrei took action. He approached an acquaintance at the company who worked in the private investigations sector. A discreet request, just to find out where the money was going. The answer came as a punch in the gut. The man Clara was seeing, Lucas, was not just a lover. He was someone from Clara's past, someone Andrei had never known existed, and the truth was about to be revealed. Now, that morning, Andrei decided he wouldn't wait any longer. He could no longer sleep next to her without knowing the full extent of the lie that had enveloped them both. He needed to confront her. He needed to hear from her what was really going on. Clara came down shortly afterwards, still in her pajamas, carefree, with a cup of coffee in her hands. Andrei's gaze followed her all the way to the kitchen table. She noticed the awkward silence, the way he looked at her, still, too serious to be just another ordinary morning. "Are you all right? You've been acting strange since yesterday." Her voice was light, but there was a trace of nervousness. Andrei took a deep breath, feeling the anger and pain rise to the surface. He didn't want to shout, but he knew this couldn't be a calm conversation. Not anymore. "Sit down, Clara. We need to talk." She stopped drinking her coffee, looking at him, trying to read something in his face. Slowly, she pulled up a chair and sat down. "What's going on?" Andrei stared at her for a moment, studying every detail of that face that was so familiar, but now so distant. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded firm, laden with a coldness he had never used with her before. "Who is Lucas?" The silence that followed was like a weight crushing the room. Clara blinked several times, as if trying to process what she had just heard. The color gradually drained from her face, and for a moment she said nothing. "Andrei, she began, but he interrupted her. "I want the truth. All of it. I already know what you're doing, I already know that he's more than a lover. What I want to hear now is your version, Clara. The truth you thought would never come out." She placed the cup on the table with trembling hands. Her eyes searched his face for something, a loophole, a chance to escape, but there was nothing. His mind was made up. Clara knew it was the end of the lies. "I knew him many years ago, before we met." He began, his voice weak, almost a whisper. "Lucas was important to me. At the time, he was just a boy who wanted to leave the country, build a new life. We had something, but it was never a serious relationship." Andrei remained still, his arms crossed. His eyes never left hers. "And what is he to you now, Clara?" "He's back. A few months ago, he came to me. He said he was in trouble, that he needed money to sort out problems with people he owed. At first, I just wanted to help. He convinced me that it was temporary, that it would be the last favor he would ever ask of me." Andrei felt his anger growing, each of her words like fuel for a fire that was about to consume him entirely. "And you thought that hiding it from me was the best option? That lying, that taking the money from our account, was the right way to solve this?" Clara tried to get up, but he interrupted her with a look. "Go on. Tell me the rest." She lowered her head, tears starting to run down her face. Clara couldn't hide them any longer. "I got more involved than I should have, Andrei. I wanted him to leave, but he started blackmailing me. He said he would tell you things about me, about the past, things I didn't want you to know. I gave in. Not out of love, not because I wanted to be with him. But because I was afraid." Andrei remained silent. His heart was beating so hard that he could hear it in his ears. Lucas wasn't just a lover, he wasn't just someone Clara had chosen to betray her marriage to. He was a ghost from her past, someone she had tried to keep away, but who had come back to destroy everything they had built together. "So you chose to lie. You chose to deceive me. Do you think that justifies what you did?" That fear erases it all. Clara began to sob. Her shoulders were shaking, her face covered by her hands. She knew there was no way to justify it. There was no way to erase it. André, for his part, felt the weight of the betrayal in a way he had never imagined. It wasn't just the physical act, it wasn't just the presence of another man. It was the lie. The trust that had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. I loved you, Clara. I gave you everything I could. And you chose to destroy all that for a man who is worthless. She raised her face, her eyes red and swollen, and tried to speak between sobs. I never wanted to hurt you, André. I lost myself. I didn't know how to get out of it. He turned away from her, walking to the window and looking out at the world outside. It was as if everything was falling apart around him, but outside, life went on. Cars passed by, people went about their routines, oblivious to the hurricane that was destroying his world. André turned slowly, looking at her one last time. Now I know who you are, Clara. And I'll never look at you the same way again. She didn't reply. There was nothing more to be said. The silence between them was deafening, filled only by the sound of a broken heart and a truth that could never be undone. And at that moment, André realized that her secret was only the beginning. There was something more, something that had not yet been revealed. And when it all came out, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. André didn't look at Clara again that morning. After the confrontation in the kitchen, he left the house without saying where he was going. The door slammed hard enough to shake the walls, as if the house was also suffering from the weight of unspoken words. Outside, the day remained cloudy, with a cold breeze that seemed to penetrate to the bone. André walked to his car, sat down in the driver's seat and took a deep breath. The emptiness inside him seemed greater than anything he had ever felt. The betrayal had been painful, but the weight of the blackmail, of the lie accumulated out of fear, made everything worse. Not only had she chosen another man, but she had used him as a shield for something he couldn't even fully understand. André drove aimlessly for a while, his hands firmly on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road, but not really seeing what lay ahead. His mind was spinning, trying to connect each piece of the puzzle. Lucas. The blackmail. The money taken without warning. What else had been hidden? What were these things from the past that Clara didn't want him to know about? He parked in a small, secluded park, where dry trees looked as desolate as he did. Sitting on the bench, his hands resting on his face, he let the first tear fall. It was a silent pain, something he had never imagined he would feel. Hours later, he returned home. The clock was almost 5 in the afternoon when André turned the key in the lock. The room was silent, but he knew Clara was still there. She appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen. She wore an expression of tiredness and guilt, as if she hadn't slept or even left the room since he had left. When she slowly climbed down, stopping a few meters from him, the silence between them became almost unbearable. We need to finish this conversation, André. He nodded, without saying a word, and walked into the living room. He sat down in the leather armchair, while Clara remained standing, as if she didn't deserve the right to occupy the same space as him. What else haven't you told me, Clara? If there's something else, now's the time. André broke the silence, his voice firm, but without the same anger as before. It was a tone of resignation, of a man tired of discovering secrets in too small doses. Clara swallowed, feeling her hands sweat. Her eyes searched the floor, as if the truth were there, hidden between the tiles. I never wanted it to come to this, André. I swear I didn't. She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, but she knew there was no easy way to explain. Many years ago, before we met, Lucas and we were close. But he got involved in something dangerous. Debts with the wrong people. I helped him, even though I knew it was wrong. I did things I regret to this day. André frowned, his mind still trying to follow what she was saying. What do you mean, did things? What kind of things, Clara? She finally sat down on the sofa, facing him, her eyes watering. I was in love with him at the time. He needed to flee the country, escape these people who were threatening him. He asked me to take money from an account where I worked, a client of the company. I did it, without thinking about the consequences. It was only afterwards that I realized what I had done. He left, and I stayed to pay the price. The client found out about the theft, but never knew it was me. Lucas disappeared, leaving everything behind. The case was closed because he took the blame in a letter and disappeared off the map. André felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just a physical betrayal. Clara had secrets he could never have imagined, secrets that involved crimes and consequences. The woman in front of him was not the same as the one he believed he knew. And now he's back. André murmured, more to himself than to her. Yes. Clara replied, her voice almost inaudible. He's back and he came to me, threatening to tell me everything. He said he had proof that I was involved in the embezzlement, even after all these years. He said that if I didn't help him, he would tell you and the police. And, André, I was afraid. Afraid of losing you, afraid of losing everything. The ground seemed to disappear beneath André's feet. He stood up abruptly, walking away from her. Each word was like a blade cutting his confidence into even smaller pieces. He ran his hand over his face, trying to think clearly, but everything seemed a blur. So you let that man back into your life. You lied to me, took our money and still hoped I'd never find out. Clara, did you realize what you were doing? She began to cry, but he no longer felt sorry. Not now. I didn't know what to do. You wouldn't understand, André. I was caught up in something that was beyond my control. André approached her, his eyes steady, his voice low and controlled. You didn't give me a chance to understand. You did it alone, Clara. You took me out of the equation. I could have helped. We could have faced this together, but you chose to lie. You chose that man, that piece of garbage, over me. She sobbed, covering her face with her hands, but André couldn't look at her anymore. He walked over to the window, taking a deep breath. The anger was now mixed with a deep sadness, as if a part of him was dying. The weight of that revelation was too much. Clara was no longer the same woman he had loved for so many years. Everything he knew about her seemed to have shattered before his eyes. I just wanted to protect you, she murmured through her tears. André turned around slowly, his voice as cold as ice. You didn't protect me from anything, Clara. You destroyed everything. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara continued to cry as André walked away once again. He knew he couldn't stay there any longer. Not in that house, not at that moment. I'm going out. When I come back, I hope you've decided what you're going to do with your life. Clara raised her face, frightened. André, please don't do this. Don't leave. He didn't answer. He picked up his keys from the table and walked out the door without looking back. Clara ran to the window, watching his car disappear down the street, as she felt everything that remained between them vanish like smoke. Outside, André was driving aimlessly once again, but now he felt that he had lost not only his trust, but also the foundation of his life. The woman he loved had destroyed everything, not just with her betrayal, but with secrets she chose to hide, even though she knew it would cost everything they had. He knew that nothing would ever be the same again. And when he finally stopped the car in a deserted street, he felt a silent tear run down his cheek. The man he had been until then had disappeared. And in the emptiness that remained, he promised himself that he would find a way out. Even if he had to rebuild his life alone. André stopped the car on the shoulder of an empty road, where the silence was almost absolute. The engine turned off, the sound of the wind beating against the trees and his own heavy breathing were all that filled the space. The scene with Clara repeated itself in his mind, like an endless echo that he couldn't silence. Her every word, every tear and desperate attempt to justify herself swirled around in his head, mixing with the image of the man she had mentioned. Lucas. Why hadn't she trusted him? Why had she chosen to carry that weight alone, dragging them into an abyss of lies? Andre didn't know what hurt him more, the physical betrayal, which was already a deep wound in itself, or the revelation of the secrets, the decisions she had made without him, which now came to light with devastating force. There was no longer the Clara he thought he knew. There was no longer the solid marriage he had believed to be unshakable. He let his head rest against the steering wheel, his eyes closed for a moment. Tears, which he had been holding back all day, slowly began to escape. A man shouldn't cry, they said. But Andre felt that, at that moment, it was impossible to avoid. It was as if all the pain of years of broken trust was finally surfacing, and he didn't have the strength to contain it. The sky was beginning to darken when Andre returned home. The silence in the room was almost ghostly. Clara was no longer in the living room, the house seemed empty, but he knew she was there, hiding in some corner, waiting for him to go upstairs or perhaps escape from reality for a few more hours. He walked slowly to the study, where the smell of her perfume still hung in the air. He sat down in the chair and stared at the framed photos on the bookshelf. He and Clara on their wedding anniversary, the two of them smiling at a sunset. Other pictures scattered around showed trips, simple moments, the life of a couple who, in anyone's eyes, were perfect. "It's all a lie," he muttered to himself, as if he needed to repeat it to understand. Clara appeared at the office door some time later. She was dressed in a sweatshirt with her hair tied up, her face still haggard, the marks of crying evident in her expression. She watched him for a few seconds, carefully, as if any sudden movement could break him even more. Andre, he didn't answer immediately. He just kept looking at the photos, as if hoping they would give him an answer he didn't have. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice low but full of pain. "Why didn't you go after the man you chose to protect with all this?" Clara walked slowly into the office and stopped a few steps away from him. "Because he means nothing, Andre. He never did. I made a mistake. I lost myself, and what I did was unforgivable, but I don't want to lose you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but," her voice faltered, the tears returning. "I love you. I always have." Andre let out a bitter laugh, running his hand over his face, exhausted. "Love? You call that love, Clara? Lying to me, taking our money, letting me believe we were fine while you fed the past that came back to destroy us? Is that love?" Clara knelt in front of him, holding his hands. "Please, Andre. I was afraid. Afraid of losing you, afraid that you'd never look at me the same way again if you knew what I'd done." He pulled his hands away, stepping back as if her touch burned. "You've already lost me, Clara. The moment you lied to me, the moment you decided to take matters into your own hands. Did you think I was weak? That I couldn't help you? That the only solution was to run to him and go back to what you were in the past?" She collapsed in tears, sitting on the floor of the office, her face covered by her hands. Andre watched her, but felt no compassion. Not anymore. That wasn't the same kind of sadness he knew. It was a different kind of sadness, the mourning of something he knew could never be rebuilt. Andre spent the next few days distant, absent even when he was at home. They hardly spoke to each other. He would leave early for work and come back late, avoiding meeting her long enough for them to talk again. Clara, on the other hand, walked around the house like a shadow, trying to keep busy, but sinking deeper and deeper into her own guilt. Everything she saw, the living room, the bedroom, the paintings on the wall, reminded her of what she had destroyed. That week, Andre made an appointment with his lawyer. He knew that, even if he hadn't made a final decision, he needed to prepare himself. The lawyer explained all the options, the possible outcomes of the divorce, but Andrei could hardly concentrate. It was as if he was watching his own life from the outside, a story that no longer felt like his own. When he returned home that evening, he found Clara in the kitchen. For the first time in days, she seemed calmer, as if she had something to say. Andrei put his keys down on the counter and stared at her. "What now?" he asked, the tiredness evident in his voice. Clara took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. "I went after him." Andrei frowned, surprised. "Lucas?" "Yes." She nodded, her voice firm. "I went after him to end this once and for all. To tell him that he no longer has any power over me, or you, or our past." Andrei crossed his arms, waiting for her to continue. "And what did he say?" "Nothing. Because he can't say anything anymore." The silence took over the room, heavy and intriguing. Andrei looked at her, trying to understand what those words meant. "What do you mean?" he asked, more firmly. Clara lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "He was found dead. 2 days ago. An overdose, so I'm told." Andrei felt the ground shake again. Lucas, the man who had been the key to everything, was no more. The chaos he had brought into their lives had dissipated as quickly as it had begun. Andrei felt something strange run through his chest, not relief, but an even greater emptiness. He hadn't expected that outcome, and yet there it was, final, unquestionable. Clara continued, "I thought you should know. I thought, maybe it could mean something to us." Andrei looked at her, the woman he had loved for so long, and realized that Lucas had never been the problem. He was just the trigger for something that had been broken for a long time. There was no death, secret or blackmail that could erase what had happened between them. There was no us anymore. "That doesn't change anything, Clara." Andrei finally replied, his voice cold and distant. "What you did, what you hid, none of it disappears just because he's gone." She nodded slowly, the tears flowing silently again. "I know." Andrei turned and walked into the living room, leaving her alone in the kitchen. He sat down on the sofa and stood there, staring into nothingness, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Clara knew that, even if he was still there physically, something inside him had gone forever. And in that silence that hung between the two of them, Andrei realized that the outcome of that story was yet to come. Andrei spent weeks in that house, living with a silence that was almost unbearable. Clara was still there, but there was no dialogue between them. They were two strangers sharing the same roof, moving like shadows that avoided meeting in the corridors. She tried to strike up a conversation from time to time, but Andrei couldn't hear her voice without feeling a wave of bitterness wash over him. The void between them had become definitive, impossible to fill. It didn't matter how many tears she shed, or how many apologies she tried to offer. Clara, for her part, spent her days trying to cling to a hope that even she no longer believed existed. She tried to get on with her life, busying herself with work, with projects that required her to concentrate in a way that never came. Her mind always went back to Andrei, to the sleepless nights when she could hear the sound of his footsteps upstairs, or the faint creak of the door when he left in the morning without even looking at her. The worst punishment wasn't the shouting or the confrontations, but that cold indifference, the dead silence of someone who had given up fighting. The day Andrei finally decided to leave was one of the hardest. Clara was in the living room, sitting on the same sofa where they had shared so many laughs, where they had planned trips and discussed everyday nonsense. He came downstairs with a suitcase in his hand, his expression serious and determined. She stood up immediately, her eyes full of tears, as if she could still stop him. "Please, Andrei. Don't do this. Don't go like that." He stopped for a moment, but didn't look directly at her. He just took a deep breath and replied in a calm but emotionless voice. "I can't stay here any longer, Clara. Not after everything. I know I made a mistake, but we can try to rebuild. It may take a while, but I'm willing to do anything." Andrei finally looked at her. There was a tiredness in his eyes, as if years of wear and tear had been condensed into a single look. Sometimes, Clara, there's nothing left to rebuild. Some things just break forever. She fell to her knees, crying silently, as he walked through the door and left the house. That house which, despite all its beauty and comfort, now seemed empty, cold, lifeless. Clara stood there, motionless, her hands pressing her face, as if she could stop the pain from escaping. André moved on, but the first few days were difficult. He rented a small temporary apartment, where every corner seemed strange and impersonal. At night, the silence bothered him as much as the one he shared with Clara, but this time it was the silence of his own loneliness. He tried to distract himself with work, dealing with meetings, spreadsheets, and phone calls, but her image still loomed large in his mind. It wasn't easy to erase the years they had shared, nor the memories that now seemed to belong to another life. One afternoon, on his way home from work, André stopped at a small café. He didn't have a specific reason, he just felt he needed to sit down, have a hot coffee and breathe for a moment. It was there that he met Mariana, a woman who, in just a few minutes of conversation, brought him a feeling of lightness that he hadn't felt for a long time. Mariana was smiling, simple and had an honest look, unlike anything André had expected to find. They chatted about trivia, the weather, coffee, books, but somehow those relaxed words were enough to make him realize that there was still life beyond the pain. That he could eventually rebuild something new. While André took the first steps towards a new life, Clara plunged into a spiral of regret and loneliness. Guilt consumed her, and André's absence made every room in the house seem more suffocating. She stopped accepting projects, isolated herself from friends and family, as if the whole world was out of reach. At night, the silence in the house was deafening, and the ghosts of the past seemed to dance around her, reminding her of every mistake, every decision that had brought her here. The days dragged on, and it was on a rainy afternoon that Clara finally made a decision. She sought out a therapist, someone who could help her understand not only her choices, but also the emptiness inside her that had led her to seek refuge in the past. For the first time in a long time, Clara began to face herself, to look in the mirror and see the truth she had avoided for years. She knew she would never get André back, but perhaps, with time, she could forgive herself and find a way to start again. André, on the other hand, found comfort in the little things. Conversations with Mariana became more frequent and, little by little, he realized that he was allowing himself to smile again. She didn't try to fix him, she didn't ask uncomfortable questions. She was just there, present, with her simplicity and sincerity. One quiet evening, as they walked through a park, Mariana looked at him and said, "Sometimes bad things happen to make room for something better, André." He paused for a moment, reflecting on those words. For the first time in a long time, he felt that it could be true. The past was still an open wound, but next to her, he was beginning to see the possibility of healing. As for Clara, the next few months were a lonely time of rebuilding. She sold the house they lived in and moved into a smaller, simple but cozy apartment. She learned to live with the consequences of her choices and to deal with her loneliness, turning it into a process of self-knowledge. Little by little, she started working again, rediscovered forgotten pleasures and began to build an independent life, without relying on anyone but herself. Lucas, the man who had been the catalyst for everything, disappeared like a shadow, taking with him the memories of the past and the secrets that destroyed a marriage. His death had closed a cycle, but not erased the scars it left behind. André and Clara never saw each other again. Somewhere along the way, he knew that she was fine, that she had found a way to move on. He did too. Years later, sitting on a bench in the square with Mariana by his side, watching children play and leaves fall from the trees, he realized that fate, however cruel, had given him a second chance. André smiled, feeling a peace he had never thought possible again. Life had somehow found a way to move on. What did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now to follow more impactful stories like this one. Remember, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. The stories here are fictional and are intended to show how the wrong choices can transform entire lives. Thanks for following us and see you next time.